Hi guys, Asmo here, and today I would like to present my feedback for GGG and the current state of the game. I'm a POE content creator, big fan and supporter of the game, and I think I'm in a unique position of someone who actually agrees with a lot of what GGG presented publicly as their vision for the game. My aim here is to help the growth and future of Path of Exile, and before I present my feedback for the current state of POE, let me preface this by saying that I am in support of the general idea that GGG has for the game, and I think that I have a pretty good understanding of it. And to give you some context as proof, about 3 months before the 3.15 patch, in which GGG nerfed a lot of multipliers and buff base damages to many support skill gems and active skill gems, and a long time before Arch Nemesis, I have already been saying that these changes are needed if GGG wants to make the PoE 2 in the way that they envision it. Of course, these changes also came with some unwanted baggage of their own issues, but I can clearly see what GGG was going for even before they were implementing these changes. So in this video, I want to focus on 3 critical areas of PoE's growth and longevity. So let's first talk about the current PoE situation in terms of the drop rates and their effects. The main reason why a lot of notable players have decided to quit this league after even less than a week of playing is the effective removal of their long-term goals and aspirations. This will no doubt be reflected in the wider population of PoE players, as they usually follow what their favorite content creators are doing. The quantity and rarity changes have left the game in an unbalanced state where players in the early stages of progression are struggling to sustain alchemy and binding orbs due to the reduced unique drop rates, reduced overall drop rates, and the effective removal of harvest reforges, a needless obstacle that only hinders the people that don't trade or do any content outside of mapping, and people who engage with things like heist will have a much better time mapping than people who actually want to focus solely on mapping. This is just the first example of GGG nerfing the newbies. The competent players will not have any issues with this, but the newbies are being punished for no good reasons, since they already have a lot of difficulties and friction to overcome. Secondly, in many areas, investing in the maps has become largely unprofitable, which is breaking the fundamental rules of scaling map encounters, which also invalidates a whole league's worth of content. This has in turn left players with a feeling of regression and lack of prospects, and it's also against GGG's own philosophy for the game. Because when the game is in a healthy state, we have a small percentage of players that are able to do aspirational content with appropriately scaled rewards as compared to the effort put in their character and map investment, and the rest of the player population will attempt to get to that point and place themselves somewhere in between Alch&Go mapping and the current top mapping strategy. And regardless of which strata of the progression the player is in, he'd either have something to look forward to and goals to work towards, or they would be at the top reaping the rewards of reaching the pinnacle content. By creating an environment where killing monsters is not the best way to make more currency, it's not a good way to make currency, then you're removing the incentives for character improvement for most players, since mapping is the main content of PoE endgame. You're also directing people toward mechanics with flat rewards coming from chests such as heist or expedition, which can be done with an extremely weak character, and this takes away the joy of just mapping and killing monsters, which is what most players would like to do for most of their time playing PoE. Whichever metrics GGG is using to judge their game and make their decisions or their interpretation has unfortunately led them away from cultivating an environment that was beneficial to the game. According to the public statistics that everyone has access to, the last meaningful growth to Path of Exile's population happened in the Ritual League, where players could strive to do T17 fractured 100% delirious maps, and Harvest was still in its unnerfed state. While these mechanics were not without issues, the fact is that players had more long-term goals, the build variety was at its all-time high, and this directly coincides with unnerfed Harvest and recombinators being in the game. Newer players could craft their basic gear and build up their character at their own pace, and more experienced players were choosing to play all kinds of different builds, knowing that they can make them work because they can craft their own gear, which otherwise would be unavailable even through trade due to fitting only niche builds and not being in big demand. This also contributed to good retention, as seen through notable players and content creators sticking with the league for much longer, another fact which directly coincides with the access to old Harvest and recombinators. The top 1% had long-term goals and projects. Everyone I talked to wanted to play more, they wanted to play the game forever, reroll to new builds, and try all kinds of content. As a personal anecdote, I myself had great plans to craft an incredibly niche plus chain bow for arc and scale arc single target damage through the multiplier coming from the number of chains, and I was going to spend probably 2 weeks and hundreds of exalts trying to make it work, but after the Harvest Manifesto and the changes it brought, it became impossible, so I lost something that really made me excited to play, which in turn made me play the game much less. Besides the quantity and rarity changes, the other glaring issue is the scaling of the monsters. This has already been addressed to an extent with the nerfs to the defensive multipliers of Arch Nemesis monsters, and while I enjoy difficult monsters and the fact that some of the Arch Nemesis modifiers made the combat more engaging, there seems to be an issue with regards to the final effective HP, which results from the combination of the modifiers. This is a general pervasive issue in PoE, which results from the base HP values of monsters of certain levels being too low and the multipliers being too high. As a result, you end up fighting an essence that takes longer to kill than a shaper, which is completely absurd in every context, from lore through frequency of encounters to the rewards and actual intended difficulty. This, as well as the rewards not being scaled appropriately, seems to stem from some fundamental misunderstanding or maybe flawed method of testing. I cannot help but assume that the game is currently not being tested by competent players who would understand the game from the perspective of beginners as well as advanced players and who would be using a modern loot filter, because an Arch Nemesis dropping armor scraps in a highly scaled T16 map is something that is very misplaced. Players who get to those tiers of maps don't need that type of currency anymore. They will hide it from their filter once they have more than 1,000 of it, which mostly invalidates the new Arch Nemesis reward structure. And I hope I don't have to even mention how bad the loot goblin mechanic is for the game, and this has been mentioned by nearly every content creator and probably hundreds of Reddit posts by now. My suggestions and solutions here are pretty simple. Alken Go mapping needs to be self-sustainable from the get-go if the player interacts with all or at least most of the league mechanics spawning inside of the map. Reasonably priced map fragments such as scarabs and delirium orbs that are not being price manipulated or have their price inflated through specific overpowered strategies need to appropriately scale the rewards and be noticeably profitable for the fundamental economy of the game to work and for people to have long-term goals related to being able to run the highest tiers of these map augmenting mechanics. Mapping content that is made more difficult through scaling the tiers of the map, level of delirium, or other difficulty increasing mechanics needs to be more rewarding in terms of average rewards per hour minus the investment cost than the content that requires less investment and less character power in order to give people long-term goals and have reasons to improve their characters. And that monster generation, or at least the rare monsters, they need a secondary check for total effective HP or thorough prior testing of the results regardless of the generation method, because encountering an extremely tanky rare should not be a regular occurrence, and the map boss should generally be the most difficult and rewarding monster in the map. Now let's talk about the second main topic for which I want to give my feedback, crafting, and specifically I want to introduce a term which I'll explain in a moment, limited progressive crafting. When it comes to crafting, things like Harvest and Recombinators are really good examples of extremely overtuned and overpowered mechanics that also contain crucial functions for the game. But because of their sheer power, the proverbial baby gets thrown out with the bathwater when GGG inevitably decides to get rid of them. To give an analogy that aptly represents it, imagine you're a company that pays people $1 million per week of work, and after 1 month, everyone quits. They got all the money they needed to spend on whatever they wanted, and they were very happy about being able to make those choices, but it was so much money that they no longer needed to work. So you decided that now you're going to give people 100 kilograms of a random vegetable per week of work. You solved the problem of people quitting the job due to no longer needing the money, but now they are unhappy because they're stuck with a vegetable they don't like and they're not able to just have money that they can spend on whatever they want, and they're now quitting after a month as well, but this time it's because their individual goals are never going to be achieved and they don't have a clear path toward them. And the solution in this analogy is to obviously pay people the money, but give them maybe $1,000 or $2,000 per week. That way they can keep their agency over what they want to spend it on, and they can pick a realistic goal to work towards. People are happy when they can progress towards something they care about, and people who have earned $1 million through consistent and deliberate work are much happier and grateful for it than people who simply won it in a lottery. And randomness is a necessary part of the game, I understand that, to make it exciting and interesting, but basic and fundamental character progression should not hinge on it. There needs to be a clear path toward it, just like, for example, with 6-linking an item, which is a great example of how crafting should look like. You can buy a 6-link from trade, you can save 1,500 fusings and use the guaranteed craft from the bench, but you can also get lucky and drop it, or you can link it with one fusing, creating a viral clip shared on social media. That's a really good system that allows you to have a clear and preset progression path that is realistic to achieve and still allows for excitement and variety, which is what crafting should be. And now to translate this into other crafting mechanics, players basically need ways of progressively improving their items. Being able to work on an item project makes the player attached to it and invested in their character. Getting a lucky drop or a lucky reforge does not. I have dropped a Mirror of Kalandra before, and I bought expensive gear for my next character, and I don't even remember what that character was, and it happened in the Scourge League. Meanwhile, my favorite character that I have ever played was an EK Trickster during the Harvest League, and I remember each individual item I crafted for that character and how happy I was for being able to do that. The items did not exist on trade, so I was able to creatively craft my characters, which kept me playing and enjoying the game more. And if you ask any content creator who was around back then, they will tell you how many messages they've been getting from people during Harvest and Ritual leagues saying, hey dude, I never liked crafting, but this league I actually tried and made some cool items. Like, most people don't craft right now. If you don't put limited progressive crafting into the game, then the game doesn't have crafting at all for most players, and it's as if it doesn't even exist, which is very, very bad for the game. Harvest and Recombinators allowed people to make crazy 6-elevated mod chest, have legacy modifier moved from mirrored items onto synthesis bases, reuse corrupted items, and do all kinds of crazy things, and these things should be nerfed and impossible or nearly impossible to do. But by removing these mechanics as a whole, instead of adding smart limitations, you're only hurting the casual player Bob. Imagine Bob the Casual found a cool amulet with some resistances and accuracy, and he needs the accuracy to fix his hit chance, so he's happy. Unfortunately, the item has no life on it, and he needs to craft minus mana cost on one of the 2 empty prefixes to be able to use his skills. Why don't you let Bob farm some league mechanic that he can opt into and try to put some life on that item? Or if the item has a life roll but it's a T9, why cannot Bob try to improve this life modifier a little bit over time? GGG has 100% control over the power of the crafts which they can give to people. They can allow them to improve the tier of the rolls, making it possible to use and improve items that they find or that they craft through various reforging mechanics like fossils, for example, which would become the way to get the base modifiers of an item without having to spam them hundreds of times hoping for good rolls, because people do not enjoy that. You can allow people to augment modifiers up to a specific tier. You can limit the number of times this can be done per item in any arbitrary way, just like you did, for example, with the splitting beast mechanics. An example of that made into a tradable currency, for example, which doesn't have to be tradable, I just want to illustrate it, could be something like Fire Orb of Refinement. Upgrade the tier of a random fire modifier by 1 up to tier 3. Another example of limitation could be allowing certain items of certain item levels to have more allowed uses of these crafts. Like, for example, item level 74 and below, you could upgrade this 1 time, 75 to 85 2 times, and 86 plus you can upgrade it 3 times, making the item levels relevant. Again, these are just examples of many arbitrary ways in which you could limit crafting to allow Bob to make whatever item he needs for his build usable. just usable, without letting people make mirror tier items easily. I cannot stress enough how important it is for PoE to give players an early access to limited progressive crafting. Just like you can spec into guaranteed essence on an Atlas skill tree early on in your mapping adventure, you should be able to spec into limited progressive crafting mechanic that will allow you to improve the items you have over time. For some reason, GGG has been designing crazy off-the-chain mechanics that break the game on purpose to excite people, but neglecting the fundamentals of what people need to enjoy the game and play the builds that they want to play. This extreme approach also creates a push-pull dynamic where people feel like something has been given to them and then taken away, leaving them worse off than before. And this is part of what creates this crazy entitlement seen in some of the Reddit posts, because people feel like you've given them something fun and then you took it away. So in general, players need long-term goals related to their character progression and mapping, and they need accessible tools of limited power to work on these things progressively from the moment they step into maps. I think that gradually taking away the long-term goals away from players, like GGG has been doing for a while, is the reason why PoE seems to have stagnated since the Ritual League, which is when they started doing this. It was the turning point where GGG went from being universally revered to being perceived as disconnected from the community, and the disconnect seems to stem from GGG having theories that actually are not based on reality and don't work out in practice. Just an example, the change to the divine orbs, for example. My guess would be that someone at GGG thinks that having harder access to divines and the removal of harvest divines means that players will take a longer time to min-max their gear, when in reality the change actually means that 99.999% of players will never even attempt to min-max their gear with divines like before, and therefore you're not extending their long-term goals, you're removing them. You're making people play the game less than before because you took away their goal of turning by turning something that was already very, very hard and limited to the top 1% into something that is now impossible and out of reach for everyone. You literally removed an aspect of the game. And this is the difference that understanding the game in practice makes. If you don't play and just theorize, you will often get it wrong. So to summarize, my main recommendation for a solution here would be to add limited progressive crafting option, which needs to be available to players from early maps, similarly to picking one guaranteed essence or strongbox in your first few Atlas passive skill points. And that more crafting options should allow people to improve and adjust their items to make them usable without always allowing for creation of powerful endgame items. This will help player retention and make dropped items more relevant. The last point I wanted to make is about the presentation and appeal of the new league mechanics, which also is directly related to the growth and popularity of PoE. There are a number of superficial changes to the presentation of the new mechanics and the game in general that can directly increase its popularity and improve the initial reception. Number one is the initial presentation of the league mechanic. For example, the Sentinel League has seen a fairly low number of people playing the league initially on day one, and part of the reason was lack of the balance changes, but another part was the unappealing nature of the presentation. GGG showed players what looked like an electrical circuit board and talked at length for half an hour about the nuances of its inner workings. People did not care about, they were spamming Resident Sleeper in the chat, got really discouraged, and those who played the game actually enjoyed the league. And the player retention, as well as the perceived player opinion of the league, was very, very good. But on the other hand, we also have an example that is the reverse, like Scourge League, which was perhaps the best looking league mechanic in history. You press a button, you get teleported to the demon dimension. It was super, super cool, and it brought back a lot of players who skipped or quickly quit 315. Scourge had a big jump in the initial number of players that started the league, and despite a lot of people disliking its reward structure, the initial appeal was incredibly high. The Lake of Calandra league mechanic suffers from a slightly different issue. Many people shared their opinion that this league feels like playing standard. This is partially due to the league mechanic being nearly invisible while mapping. A subtle, small, grey, nondescript pillar with a boring, unnoticeable minimap icon slowly emerges from the ground with a quiet rumble. Players don't feel like they're encountering anything. Even if the league mechanic was rewarding, it feels like they're getting nothing in their maps and have to go out of their way for a chance to find anything. This contributes to the players' unhappiness with the current league. These things are very impactful and important, and you could easily test it by, for example, adding a patch to the game that allows players to smash and charge through the doors, shattering them into splinters and bending the metal gates. If you added the ability to shield charge, for example, that would allow people to smash through the doors, you would notice a huge increase in the usage of the skill without making any balance changes to it. And aside from the presentation, I think it's also more beneficial to release the new league mechanics slightly more rewarding than other content currently in the game. It is better to give people a little bit too much at the start and nerf it or even stealth nerf it after a few days than do it the other way around. Because by releasing the league in a less rewarding state, you're generating bad PR from everyone playing the game at the point where you have the maximum number of players playing and talking about PoE. At that moment of peak interest, it is incredibly crucial to captivate people's interest and avoid bad news spreading around. If a new player, for example, asks a friend if they should play the new league and he hears, well, maybe not now because it's not good, but they will probably fix it in 2 or 3 weeks, that player will never come and try it out. But if they hear, yo, get in while it's good, you can hook him in and he won't care or notice even a 50% nerf to the league mechanic rewards that happens over time because he's not competent yet. So to summarize my last point, in order to keep growing the PoE player base, simple and impactful presentation of the league mechanic beats an intricate and nuanced presentation. The people who want to dig deep will find the relevant information anyway, and you're presenting to the people who are not PoE veterans if you want to grow the game. And then releasing the league mechanic that is new in a state that is a little bit too rewarding and then maybe nerfing it slightly over time is preferable to the reverse from players' enjoyment as well as the promotional point of view. I have more feedback that I could give, but I wanted to focus on what I think are the 3 most important points that GGG needs to address if they want to keep growing their game. I hope this message finds its way to GGG and contributes to the game getting better in the future. I love PoE and respect GGG's commitment to making a cool and enjoyable game that isn't consumed by modern market trends and allow us to be so creative while playing it. So I'd like them to continue doing this. Thank you so much for watching and see you next time. Have a good one.